We're going to get this show on the road straight away. We have got our first panel, and this panel is going to delve into Samhain. What is Samhain? What does it mean? How relevant is it today? All the myths, the legends, the folklore, the laws, and all of the history attached. And you're going to come out of this room a lot wiser than when you come in. And I have with me Tracy Thorndike. Has an excellent Substack that you should read, Tracy Dawn. And Kevin Flanagan, founder of the Brehon Academy, Ireland, one of Ireland's leading experts in Brehon laws and in ancient Ireland and all its myths and customs and all of that good stuff. And Thomas Sheridan, the man himself, artist, writer, podcaster, and a man who can tell a story like no other man can in the traditional Irish style. So, guys, are we ready to get this show on the road? Well then, without further ado, Kevin, I think you're first man up, so I'll leave it to you. Off you go.
Hey, folks. Just by show of hands, who was here last time? Okay, and who's the first time? It's about 30%. Well, you're very welcome if you're here for the first time. I'm Kevin Flanigan, and I'm going to talk to you today about the origins of Halloween, which did, believe it or not, begin in Ireland. The word Samhain, some people think means summer's end. Samhain is summer, and Samhain means summer's end. And traditionally, it was one of the 4 key events on the Celtic/Gaelic calendar. The other events were Imbolc in spring, Bealtaine in summer, Lunasa in autumn, and Samhain marks the Celtic New Year. This was the end of the harvest season, and it was the beginning of the new year, because in early Ireland, the way they thought about it was that the day began when the sun set. It wasn't sunrise to sunrise, it was sunset to sunset. So as they were going into this darkest period of the year, they could consider this to be the new year. Now I'm going to tell you 3 stories, if I can have enough time to get through them all. I'm going to tell you about the origins of why do we carve pumpkins. I'm also going to talk to you about where does the tradition of children dressing up and people dressing up come from. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about a case that happened in the late 19th century of a burning of a witch. So, let's start with the jack-o'-lanterns. There was a man who lived in a village, and he was a very stingy man. He was called Stingy Jack. He was a blacksmith. And why was he stingy? Because he would always look for an opportunity to leave someone shortchanged, whether he did it with wordplay or with trickery. And he would mix bad iron for good iron. And so he was just known to be a miserly bastard. And so when the devil came to take him, he used his wiles and he tricked the devil. He said, "Oh, I'd really love an apple. My last request before you take me to hell, give me an apple." So the devil climbs up the apple tree, and then, quick thinking, he carved a crucifix on the tree. That trapped the devil up there. So he says, "I'll let you down if you give me 10 more years of life." And the devil agreed. 10 years later, the devil came to collect his soul. And Jack tricked the devil again. He said, "Oh, do you know what I'd love? I'd love just one more drink." So the devil turned himself into a coin that he could use to buy the drink. But quick thinking Jack, he put the coin in his pocket next to a holy medal and trapped the devil again. And then the devil said, let me out. He goes, "Only if you agree not to take me to hell, ever." And so the devil agreed. Now, when Jack finally died, St. Peter, when he got to the pearly gates, said, "No, because of the twisted and corrupted life you've lived, you're not welcome in heaven either." And so the devil had to keep his oath, and poor old Jack had to wander between the two worlds, not able to go to heaven or to hell. And then, over time, people would see the flickering of the light. I forgot to mention, the devil threw a coal at Jack. And this was a coal that would never go out. It was too hot to hold, but it would never go out. So what did Jack do? He got a turnip, and he carved out the turnip, and he put the coal in the turnip, and he carried the turnip. That was originally what Irish people were using before we got pumpkins. So, on Samhain, the Irish people would carve turnips that looked very scary, and initially it was to scare away Jack of the Lantern, and also to scare away the fairy folk. And that's going to become a very important theme throughout this talk that I'm sharing with you now. We got the pumpkins when the Irish emigrated to America, and the pumpkins were much more readily available. But I want to go back to the Mise Éire, which was written in the 11th century. Now, this is a book of the invasions of Ireland. There was many waves of invasions of people, and the third wave that came to Ireland were called the Nemedians. And there was another great group of people on the island called the Fomorians. Now, the Fomorians are depicted as the bad gods. They're always depicted as chaos, monstrous. They came from the sea. But they did have some beautiful people among them as well. And so the Fomorians, or the Nemedians, were living their life, but they were being harassed by the Fomorians. The Fomorians were attacking them again and again. And eventually, they imposed a tax on them that should be paid at the end of the year, which happened to be Samhain. And the tax that they imposed on them was 1/3 of their corn, 1/3 of their dairy products, and 2/3, should I say, 2/3 of their corn, 2/3 of their dairy, and 2/3 of their children. Which, to me, I read into that like this is a mythological way of saying that that's a sacrifice. The children are being offered up as a sacrifice. They had to give up the children to the Fomorians. And this tax was being paid year after year. And eventually the Nemedians said, that's enough, we can't do this anymore. Let's attack the Fomorians. And the Fomorians had a base on Tory Island. Incidentally, Tory is the Irish for tower. And they did a surprise attack. The leader of the Fomorians at the time was Conand, and later Mork. And I want you to get a visual in your mind right now of the tower that was on Tory Island. If you're having difficulty with that, I'm asking you to imagine the tower in Lord of the Rings. Because J.R. Tolkien was influenced somewhat by Irish mythology, Welsh mythology, and so on. So they attacked Conan's tower, they destroyed it, but they didn't succeed. They were counterattacked, and they were completely wiped out. Some accounts say there was a plague, and that's where the word Tala comes from, because Tala in Irish is Teolacht, which means the plague grave. So only 30 of the Nemedians survived, and they fled Ireland, and they broke into two groups. One of those groups became the Firbolg. They went to the north of Greece, Thrace, and the other group became Tuatha And they went to a different place, and they started to learn magic, necromancy, divination, powerful arts. Now, when they both returned to Ireland, they sent a representative each. So Firbolgs came first. They were ruling for a short amount of time. Then the Tuatha came back. And they both sent representatives to meet each other, and they were shocked when they found that they could speak each other's language. And that's because they were both descendants from the Nemedians. Incidentally, Nemed means sacred ones. That's why we have Naomh, Naomh, to mean saint or sacred. So, The first battle of Moytora took place, and the Tuatha De Danann completely destroyed the Firbolgs. And then the second battle of Moytora took place. Why? Because Nuada lost his arm, so he couldn't. Nuada was the king of the Tuatha De Danann. He lost his arm in the battle, the first battle of Moytora, and he couldn't lead the Tuatha De Danann anymore. So Bress, who was half Fomorian, came in as the new leader, and he imposed that tax, that same tax that would be collected on Samhain every year. So what I'm trying to emphasize here, what I'm trying to highlight is the very powerful effect that this belief in the fairy folk, in the Tuatha De Danann, who eventually became the hill people, the people of the hills. There was such a fear among the Irish people that they would tie sheaths on the tails of the cattle to stop the fairies turning the milk sour. They would smear butter on the window edge because that fear was so deep ingrained in them. And I mentioned the first story with the devil and Jack because the Irish had a really good way of balancing their belief in God, Christian God, and also their beliefs in paganism and the fairy folk. And when you read about the accounts of the fairy folk later, it reads a little bit like poltergeist or mischievous spirits like jinn. And that's why they called the fairy folk Nadini Maha, because they wanted to appease them, because they might be listening. And so this was such a strong belief, especially the belief in the changelings. Has anybody heard of the changeling? Okay. So a changeling was when your baby or a member of your family would be snatched away. W.B. Yeats' The Stolen Child. That poem is about this fear. And this was such a real fear that up as recent as 1895, Bridget Cleary was burned alive by her husband and a bunch of other people from the village. And the story goes that Bridget had come home from selling her eggs, and she was selling eggs near Kyle Nagrana Ferry Fort. And so she came home and she was diagnosed by Dr. Crean of having bronchitis and nervous excitement. That's the quote. But Michael Cleary wasn't having any of this because Michael Cleary believed in the Pishog, which is another word for witchcraft, for dark magic. And also there was a fairy lore in his family which said something like, Bridget was overheard saying to her husband Michael, "Your mother was taken away by the fairies." And Michael said, "Did she tell you that?" She said, "Yes, she was taken away for 2 nights, she told me." So I'm telling you all of this just to emphasize and give you a real good idea of how deeply ingrained these beliefs were in the Irish people, especially the rural people. So on the 13th of March, who came over to the house? The priest, and blessed Mary. And at the same time, her husband was looking for a fairy doctor to find herbs to make a potion to get rid of the fairies. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you had, on one hand, you had the Christian belief, and on the other hand, you had the fear and belief and respect for the fairy folk, the other crowd. So Michael believed that this wasn't his wife, it was a changeling. She had been replaced by the fairies and she's now a witch. And he began to torture Bridget. He began to torture Bridget for 2 days, 2 days and 2 nights. And he wasn't alone in this. A lot of Bridget's cousins were there as well. And her cousins were holding her down on the bed while he force-fed this noxious juice that was made by Dennis Gainey, was the name of the person who he got their fairy herbs off. That was the fairy doctor. And so one thing led to another, and he started to force-feed Bridget, Started to force feed Bridget. Somebody made a cup of tea for Bridget, and also there was bread and jam. And so he cut up the bread into 3 pieces, and he said, you're not going to have the drink until you say your name 3 times. In the name of God, are you Bridget Cleary? Are you the wife of Michael Cleary? So help me God, say it now, say it now. And she did. She did say it all these times, but that still wasn't enough for Michael Cleary. And so he jumped on her, he pushed her to the ground, she banged her head off the floor, and he put his knee on her chest and held her by the throat and said, are you my wife? Are you my wife? And then he threw oil onto her and she burned. They burned Bridget Cleary alive. And that wasn't all they did. They buried her in a shallow grave just 105 yards from her house. And the body was found on March 22nd, 1895. And between the time that the body was buried and the body was discovered was about 4 days. And every night, Michael Cleary, he went up to the fairy fort with a knife, and he was convinced that his wife was going to come back on a horse, on a white horse. And if he cut the strings off the horse, he could have her back. And he was heard saying things like, once he realized she wasn't coming back, he says, I burned her, and I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for John Donne, who told me she was a fairy. So the twist to the story is he wasn't actually done for murder, even though he murdered her. He was actually done for manslaughter. Why? Because the jury believed that he really believed she was a fairy. Like, his defense was delusion, superstition, and the jury actually accepted that. Now, there was a famous poem, I guess it's famous at the time, and the poem went, are you a witch, or are you a fairy, or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name's Tracy, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Christian side of Samhain, Halloween, and beyond. Excuse me, I'm a bit hoarse today. So in my working life, I work as a duck guide at Drumcliff Church, and it's a monastic site that dates back to the 6th century. But of course, as many of you'll know, W.B. Yeats is buried there. So it's like being in between the two worlds. Much as Samhain, you've got the old world and the new. Half my time spent talking about Yeats, about mythology, and the other half about early Celtic Christianity. And what I want to do is kind of bring you into how Christianity kind of aligned with Samhain and almost, I'd like to say, protected and worked with the festival that Kevin's just spoken about. Now, rather than take over completely, in the 8th century, Pope Gregory III, he decided that the traditions in Ireland were that embedded within the people and the festival of Samhain and also Easter, that there was no way to break away from the kind of alignment of the dates. What they were going to do was merge the two festivals there. And it was almost as though he acknowledged that the Irish traditions were rooted to the land, and they grafted the Christian traditions onto the ancient Irish traditions. So this kind of brings us into All Souls Night, All Souls Day, All Hallows Eve, and the kind of practices that were similar to those we had in Samhain, but also took on a new format in the worship of the saints and also the souls that were lost in purgatory. So where we had the Samhain feasts, we would have people then commemorate the saints on All Souls Day who had passed away. So we're not just talking about the big saints here. We're talking about like there were hundreds and hundreds of more saints than we know today. And then All Souls Day, you would have the feast, and you would remember that people who had passed on. And it was assumed that not everybody went to heaven. They would be locked in some kind of purgatory. And the jack-o'-lanterns that Kevin mentioned earlier would be used by the people that were going around door to door to light the way for these souls. And as the children went door to door, they'd be given bracken bread and soul bread in order to be able to kind of exchange food for prayers for these souls. And this Christian kind of alignment with the old world, acknowledging the dead, it's probably what kind of carries through the two traditions that we have in existence today still. Now, the Christians get kind of a bit edgy when you're talking about Halloween, and you know, obviously there is a difference between the pagan past and the Christian element of this season. But there is kind of a bigger disconnect that we have today in the new form of Halloween. And it's almost like the Halloween that is celebrated today isn't connected to either Christianity or Samhain. It's more of a secular Halloween. It's a multi-million, billion-pound industry. Now, last year, Halloween, the season of Halloween, was said to have made £12 billion. And this all comes about from the mass emigration to America during the famine or genocide, whatever way you want to frame it. But when people left Ireland, with them they took their traditions. And as time went on, and for factors due to the fact that, like in New England, Puritans would have seen even the celebration of All Hallows Eve as a very Catholic kind of ceremony, they would have no tolerance for it. So it changed in time. And I know people probably my age will remember the bobbin apples, the nuts, things that aligned us to an older time, a pagan time. But all of a sudden they were metamorphosized into candy, sweets, and then you had the kind of event of trick-or-treating, which was very different to going and knocking on doors and praying for the souls of the departed. The trick-or-treating almost put children into a liminal space. And that space, for a very short period of time, one day, they were on par with the adults. So they were bartering with the adults, saying, right, you give me a treat or I'm going to trick you. And then you had the tradition of eggs being thrown, wires being cut, tires being deflated. So you had this kind of almost retribution for not being given something of worth, like a candy bar. Now, it was during kind of the 1930s that this was kind of taken a hold. The Halloween, the shops were stocking masks rather than people making their own costumes. But in 1938, something very, very different happened that kind of shook the senses of about 6 million people in America. And that was the broadcast of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds on the radio. It was broadcast on the 30th of October at 8 o'clock. And the company, I think it was called Mercury, but it was a fairly smallish radio kind of theatrical company that was broadcast on CBS. Now, Orson Welles, he opens the play, and he basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something along the lines of, the human race has been living this long, and it's been monitored by extraterrestrials who are getting kind of dissatisfied, and they want to kind of. I think I've got that wrong, but he opens it like this, but then it goes straight into what appears to be a real life news broadcast. Now, for people that just tuned in, they wouldn't realize that this was a real life news broadcast. They'd just be like, what am I hearing? But what they were hearing was the country, or the New Jersey, they pinpointed, had been taken over by Martians, and that there was attacks going on. There were real life broadcasts from commentators saying, appearing absolutely petrified. Now, this set off a mass hysteria in America, or certainly New Jersey anyway. The switchboards were full. Nobody could get through to anybody. And the people in New Jersey who were waiting for this imminent attack from Mars, or the Martians, they were kind of fleeing to the hills in cars. Now, the police on the motorbikes who didn't have the radio, we were kind of, this is 1938, didn't know what was going on. And, it was complete chaos. Even though there was some kind of interjection through the play saying that this is a play by, whoever it was, I think it was H.G. Wells that wrote it, wasn't it? The following day, the radio station got into an awful lot of trouble, and it was kind of a really, really big thing in America, that it was basically a psychological attack that had taken place. Now, the fallout of this was on the 31st of October, so Halloween. And all over the world, there were newspaper reports saying that there'd been mass hysteria and people were kind of terrified and all the rest of it. And even Adolf Hitler, on the 8th of November, made a speech from Munich saying that it was evidence of the decadence of democracy. But what it actually was, it was the first psychological attack, albeit through entertainment, that people had experienced. And they aligned it with Halloween. Now, what made this particularly gruesome and scary was that whilst this kind of play was being held, the backdrop to all the other radio programs was the build-up to World War II. So there was already great anxiety. I don't know whether you can see where I'm going with this. Fake news in a line with real news. So after World War II, and we get into the 50s, Halloween in America really starts taking off. It becomes a bigger event, families get involved, and it's very much more commercialized. Now, as we get into the later decades, we have Halloween, but we also have stories running alongside Halloween. And these stories are of a different horror, of apples being impaled with razor blades, and Tylenol, which has been in the news recently, being put into sweets. So you're having this festival, but you're also having this external anxiety put upon you. And it's at this point, the newspaper or the media at the time, because we have TV, are able to kind of secularize what we know, what we once knew as Samhain, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, into something that is almost detached from any kind of belief system, any religion. The costumes are getting scarier, the tricks are getting worse, and also there's this kind of anxiety, especially over the children. Now, this comes in accordance with the horror movie industry making more and more grotesque films. And I know, Nightmare on Elm Street seems very benign right now, but when you think to what we're faced today with. But Hollywood was taking advantage as well from the 50s of the fact that fear became this kind of dopamine hit. What they were saying, I listened to something recently, and it said that when people were put in a altered state of fear, like walking into the haunted houses, having people jump in, scare them, it created in people this thing called benign masochism. And what benign masochism does is it kind of accumulates in time, so that after a while, the hit that that would sustain you, you know, that kind of exhilaration of fear, won't sustain you. So it's like this kind of the psychology today or something described it as a cumulative, the same way that a cocaine addict would need more and more, or a gambler. But the offset of this is when your fear responses are manipulated in such a way, your natural fear responses, your natural ability to deal with stress and fear decreases. And also your cognition. So it actually brings you to a time where, as much as you can be engaged with all this media, the films, when faced with a real threat, such say like a pandemic or something, you know, did I say that wrong? When faced with standing up to something real, you're not going to, because you've been put in the mindset for decades and decades of being in this kind of fight or flight thing where your amygdala or whatever it's called isn't working properly. Now, as they've secularized Halloween, I had a brief look through scroll through the news yesterday, and it's amazing. There's very, very little, although there is a pushback to Samhain now, and they are talking about the church, it's still very apparent that the news media, or the media, have very much a kind of say in how it's celebrated, from why you shouldn't put your lights on at Halloween, to what candy you should give your children, or what chocolate you should give your children, to even why you shouldn't dress up as a political figure. So there was a full page, I think it was in an English paper, and it was saying that dressing up as President Trump is very, very kind of, I can't remember the word it was, it could be triggering or something for people. Although his mannerisms are easy to kind of take over, it will upset people. So they were telling people not to dress up as President Trump. And this, like I say, is a complete disconnect. What the secular world didn't have was the wisdom, obviously, of the ancient world, and also the wisdom of the Christian world to align itself with the ancient world. And I think what we're finding today is that we all speak of this battle between good and evil, darkness and light, and this spiritual war that we are now facing. But one bright thing about that is that people are returning to faith, whether it be Christian faith or whether it be faith of an older style of our pagan world. And, you know, it's kind of indicative of the fact that Hollywood is no longer relevant. It's not viable to make a movie in Hollywood anymore. So I think I'll end it there, because I don't want to start. Thank you.
Dig with everybody, August Volcha. Welcome to Mise Éire 2 again, and thanks for all showing up. Kevin spoke about Celtic Ireland, Iron Age basically, and Tracy spoke about the modern interpretations of Samhain. But like, I want to take it way back, old school, you know, like a Philadelphia soul band, really go back now, because I just realised it's never been the most appropriate Halloween ever in Ireland, because we have elected a president that looks like the Crypt Keeper from Tales of the Crypt. Just joking. Yes, anyway, prior to the Celtic times, whatever the Celtic times were, that period in the Iron Age, that was the longest period that Irish people existed. They existed way back, possibly up to 14,000 years ago to the Proto-Europeans. So that's how long we've been on this island. And that's how much of a stake we have in this island. And regardless if it goes from pagan times to Christian times, we're continuing a story that's not going to end this year, next year, or in a century's time, but we'll be here again in 11,000 years from now. I'm sure of that. Right? Well, I don't mean literally we'll be here 11,000 years, but, you know. Oh, yeah, you will be. Now, we know that this autumnal festival, Samhain, as we call it now, or Halloween, existed in both the Bronze Age and the Neolithic, the New Stone Age time. Why? Because there are numerous passage mounds around the country, and in Britain and in other countries, that are aligned with the autumnal equinox. So this was definitely a period of celebration long before we ever heard of the Celtic tribes or any of the things that Kevin was talking about. We have an ancient heritage in this country that, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about, but there's a lot of kind of detective work going into it. And I consider myself a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes in this aspect as well, doing this myself for a long time. I wrote a book years ago called The Druid Code. And basically, a lot of what we take today, everything from the dressing up to everything, the jack-o'-lanterns, has a spectacularly ancient history. In fact, we don't even fully appreciate how ancient it actually is. We see, like, you know, we hear about Queen Maeve and Finn McCool, and then later, you know, Cuchulainn, and then the whole mythological cycle. But that's relatively recent in terms of Irish history. That's relatively recent. We're much, much thousands of years older again. And you should always remember that, because this is a fleeting moment. This is a blink, a parenthesis in a phenomenal, endless saga. And you should always remember that. Now, through exercises in comparative mythology, trying to study alignments and particular rock art at these megalithic, Neolithic sites, we do know, as I said, for sure, that there was definitely orientations towards the autumnal equinox. So Samhain is at least 5,500 years old, and that's at least. They may have built wooden structures before that still had those alignments as well. But we know it's 5,500 years old. Now, there's a whole sort of mythology, well, academic mythology, that the megalithic structures in megalithic Europe came as a result of the development of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, which spread out to the western margins of Europe. Then why are the megaliths in the west coast of Ireland the oldest in Europe, and also the ones in Orkney and other places? So obviously that story isn't true. Also, I actually believe that rather than the agricultural revolution, as they call it, bringing it across the megalithic culture, I believe it ended it. Because agriculture makes you a slave. This is the whole thing of the fall from Babylon that's been carried through many cultures that, you know, we would have had, they say hunter-gatherers. It makes it sound like very, very simplistic, you know, like some guy going around battering a sparrow. No, the country was abundant in food, especially if you lived at the coast. Look at the shell middens around Sligo, literally billions of shells that were people in Neolithic and Bronze Age times were able to harvest seafood all year round. So you didn't have to worry about seasonal things, storing things up. And the rivers were full of salmon, bigger than we get today. The eggs were everywhere, and they ate things, all kinds of things. Food. This country was a food island with more than enough to sustain it. And so this element from the Levantine lands, like so many things that have been brought from the east that have damaged us, agriculture, ended a phenomenal period in Ireland and Scotland and England and Britain of the megalithic builders. And it made people slaves. You can't build these enormous structures if you've got to go out and plant grain, harvest, plow, watch the crops, and this creates wars and everything over territorial, demarcations. They were much different. They were completely different. They had a different consciousness because they could there was an abundance of food. And we know this by the quality of their bones, their teeth. We know this by the few bodies we found in these places. A lot of these things they call burial mounds, they're very short on bodies, even when they open them up brand new. But what bodies have been found, they showed to be very healthy people. They had very good nutrition. Why? Because they were eating the best salmon out of the rivers. They were eating beautiful shellfish and seaweed off the beaches, and they had plenty of iodine in their system. And then they had all this time to study the stars, the alignments, the rising suns and moons and everything, and build these megaliths all over the country with incredible amounts of rock art. Fantastic, right? So, there was still the winter. We know from dendrological records that the winters were quite severe even back then. Even when the summers were better, the winters were still quite severe. So, what do you have on the cusp of winter? You have one last party, one last celebration, one last festival, and that is the origins of Samhain Halloween. Because you didn't know if you were going to be around in spring. So it forced this sensation of absolute mortality upon you. And so you said, well, you know, it's the sun is getting lower in the sky every day. The weather's getting cooler. And, you know, your granny died last year from hypothermia. Your auntie died 2 winters ago, you know, and so did 2 of her kids. We could go as well. So they were forced to confront their mortality. Very, very healthy thing to do. Not a bad thing to do. And so the whole thing of these Samhain festivals, whatever they were called then, obviously Ireland was actually operating under a solar cult. We know that because of all the alignments. So it's actually a solar cult. And so you were forced to face your mentality. So this whole thing of it being a spooky thing and the ghosts and everything, that's been distorted much later on. It was a time of ancestral veneration. It was a time of saying our ancestors were here. We're here now. And this is the time of year, because of our possible impending mortality, depending on how bad the winter may be, we're very close to them now. We're very close to them. And when they spoke about the other world, they didn't talk about a hell or a heaven or a kind of a place where ghosts went. That was an alternate reality to them. This is universal, actually, not just within our ancient Irish culture. This was universal. And the other world was where the ancestors were. And when they would dream, say your brother had died a year before and you had a dream about him, it wasn't just like, oh, I had a dream about, you know, whatever his name was last night. It was lovely. You actually met him. They believed that you were actually over there in the other world. And, you know, things like, you know, quantum wave fluctuations and things like string theory have only made these things more and more believable with the passage of time. That the closer we get to the fundamental building blocks of the universe, the more we understand our ancestors better, ironically enough. So, we also know that a huge part of their diet was hazelnuts. And this would be to sustain them during the winter, because it wouldn't just be a case that they couldn't get food. They couldn't get it often because of the weather. It might be snowing or really bad weather. They'd be indoors all the time, and they'd be living off hazelnuts. And hazelnuts were preserved by smoking them. They would smoke them with smoke. And we know that hazelnuts ingested in this manner, in sizable quantities, are hallucinogenic. Well, not directly, not say you would have like psilocybin mushrooms, but like they definitely improve dreams. I'm sure you've all ate loads of nuts and then you went to bed, like especially hazelnuts and things like that, and you had these amazing dreams. You wake up next morning, got unbelievable dreams. You ever want to have a great dream? Eat nuts. Whatever's in them. No, not that one. But isn't it funny how the women all giggled then, wasn't it? And I've also noticed the fellas that did it. But anyway, so these were, you know, these were portals into other realities that gave great comfort to people. That when you died, and when the Morrigan or the Raven goddess took you up to heaven, or to the other world. And this is why there's no fingers on the corpses. The ravens and the crows used to take the fingers when they were excarnating the corpses. Interesting. And you were with the ancestors. There was no sense of, I'm here in this material world, that's the end of that. Whatever takes place in here is totally fantasy. No. If anything, they believed the material world was actually the fantasy, and the actual dream, other world, was the reality. You know, and this is common through things like Hinduism and all kinds of other belief systems, pre-Christian, pre-Abrahamic belief systems. And a lot of the demonization, literally demonization, of our ancient pagan customs comes from a belief that these were communications with devils. This comes directly from the Old Testament, not our book, but I'm not going to judge if you're into it, that talks about magic and communication with ancient spirits is devil worship. And that was imposed upon us by outsiders. It was a kind of psychic colonialism that was imposed upon us, just like what Tracy was saying about the War of the Worlds. We have to be very careful in our belief packages. Very careful. We're led in all kinds of directions by theological into theological cul-de-sacs that rob us of a full appreciation of our consciousness and our psychic development as beings. And one of them is the attack on Halloween. Right now in the United States, there's literally non-stop attacks on pagans. What did I do? I didn't bomb Iraq. You know, I didn't do any of these things, you know. I wasn't under Biden's hotel room. And yet, these were being demonized again. I think a lot of this is coming from very sinister operations that are working through these evangelical churches in the Deep South. I think they're actually afraid of people looking to their ancestral past. And that doesn't mean they're becoming pagans. They're still Christians, but they're looking with more fresh eyes, where you have one side saying, like, I've actually seen reports on American programs recently that even had a slight anti-Irish element to them, that were saying things like, well, you know, we wouldn't have this Halloween horrible demon-worshipping day if these Irish didn't come to America. It's quite sinister in a lot of ways. It's like we're seeing things that we haven't seen from like the mid-1800s and Thomas Nast and the fear of Irish immigrants. I was like, whoa, this is a bit weird. But it all seems terribly organized. It all seems to be happening at the same time. And you have all these what they call conservatives. This is why I don't like conservatives. They're just as control. I'm definitely a centrist. I'm an anarchist. I don't trust either the left or I like the middle. I like the middle ground. And you can definitely see how that's deeply controlled as well. Because they're all like someone's handing them a press release, the problem now is pagans, Halloween is bad. And all these stories they share in America about candy and apples having razor blades in them or they're laced with LSD. That's all spread by these evangelical churches who have a vested financial interest in keeping down this festival and people enjoy it. Now, funny enough, the Catholic Church has been the best of all. If you look at the history of witch persecutions in Europe, there's been almost no witch persecutions in Catholic countries. Almost none. And very little compared to Protestant, particularly Calvinist and Lutheran countries. And this, what Kevin was mentioning, those stories will stand out because there's only 4 of them in the whole history of Ireland, where there are thousands of witch persecutions across the sea in Calvinist Scotland. Germany, forget about it, out of control. They were killing them on an industrial scale. Entire villages were wiped out in Sweden and Finland. We didn't have, you heard about the Pendle witches in England. King James, the hammer of the witches, the Malus Maleficarum, the King James Bible, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. These were all phobias brought about by Calvinists and Lutherans in that period. I'm not saying they're like that now, of course they're not, but in that period, it was a handy thing. They were having these sectarian wars. They could declare the local Catholics or Huguenots, whatever, to be witches, and then they could persecute them. And the Catholic Church, to its eternal credit, I think, I know there's lots of other things wrong, but to its eternal credit, its attitude towards things like magic and even pagan leftovers, that's why we still have holy wells, was to rename them. The old Druid wells became holy wells. The old, even Pope Boniface spoke about actually, reusing the temples of the heathens because they're so well built. Just take what he said, the unclean idols out of them, sprinkle them with holy water, because the people are familiar with these locations for their ideas of veneration and transcendental feelings beyond the material. And so the Catholic Church always had this kind of thing like, well, it's hard, once they don't start building churches and they're still Catholics, they can do all their folk magic, their folk healing and all this stuff. Because after Martin Luther, which ironically happened, he hammered his nail the post of the poster on Halloween. And that's a very interesting story as well. If you go to the Market Kirche in Hanover, it's one of the most prime Lutheran churches in Germany, and it has a pentagram on one side of the spire, a huge pentagram that's lit up all night, and you can see it all over the city of Hanover. And on the other side, a hexagram, two magical symbols that were in the center of witch persecutions. So, I made a documentary a few years ago about the Pendle witches things, and there's the same royals who were killing people and burning them and stoning them and hanging them for witchcraft were obviously doing it themselves. So there was almost like they knew stuff worked and they kept it to themselves. There's a long history of this stuff, where they what's his name? Prince Andy goes back a long way in all different guises. And it's not just exclusive to the Epstein stuff. But yeah, so a lot of the prohibitions and phobias, I heard some people were complaining about, I saw some posts about this, not many, about, this is a pagan thing. No, I'm not here as a pagan, I'm here as an Irishman. That's what I'm here. I'm not here as an Irishman, okay? That's what I'm here as. And I am not ashamed of every aspect of my heritage, even going right back for thousands of years, and I think it's all valid. It's brought us all to this point. And we shouldn't be anyway. There should be no schism between a Christian and Halloween, especially an Irish one. An Irish Christian who attacks Halloween or Samhain, it's like, there's a bit of self-hatred there. Who put that into your head? That your ancestors weren't like that. I mean, they weren't. And you're basically attacking your own heritage. So you've got to make a decision. Are you an Irish person or are you a Christian? If you're going to think that way, of course, I'm not telling people to think that or forcing that on them. I'm just saying you do have to start being mature about these things. And my attitude is that it's the same. Look, I like going to Catholic spots. I like going to holy wells. I love going into beautiful old churches. I love going into basilicas. I love visiting religious art galleries. I don't sit there feeling like that I'm in danger. And Christians shouldn't feel like they're in danger too when they go and trick-or-treat, cut jack-o'-lanterns, or even go visit the Cave of the Morrigan in Tulskin, County Roscommon. And just one more, I've got time? Just before that, there's the demonization again. The cave in Tulsk of the Morrigan, Owen Gat, they tried to close it recently to prevent people going down there on Samhain. You shouldn't really go down on Samhain. My attitude to this stuff is let the old gods and spirits have their own privacy on these dates. But they said there was high levels of carbon dioxide. And I'm seeing this all over, not only Ireland, but in Britain, that they're restricting access to ancient sites. And I'm quite concerned about it. It's beyond UNESCO throwing a fence up around it like they have at Newgrange and Stonehenge and now Holy Island, and they're trying to do it as Carramore and Sligo. It's gone beyond that. They literally have in some places in England, like Avebury, security guards going around, and they see someone meditating, and they say, "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" And that will come here too. That will come here too, because there's been a long agenda to disconnect us from our past. Why? Well, it's the Great Reset, isn't it? It's the Great Reset. You come from nothing, you are nothing, and you're only going along with us. And that's why I would say to everybody, Christian, atheist, pagan, whatever, you worship a horsefly named Eric, I don't care. Venerate, even in a secular way, the ancestral heritage that's held within the soil of this land. It's called Éire. It's named after a goddess called Eru. Once you realize that, you know that you're standing on a sacred land, and she is your mother, and don't let her down. Thanks very much.